I'm Teddy Downey, executive editor here at the Capital Forum, and I'm joined by Neil Tracey, one of our trade correspondents, and of course, Beth Baltzan, senior advisor at the Capital Forum and former counselor for trade and investment to U.S. Trade Representative Katherine Tai. Thank you two so much for doing this today.
Thank you.
Great to be here.
Got a lot to cover, so I'll ask the first question. Neil, maybe you can ask the second one, but first here, Beth, we've got a next round of trade letters. We've got, depending on what topic you're talking about, Wall Street ignoring it, hoping that there's a taco trade. What's been your reaction to this latest round of trade threats from the president?
So it's hard when you look at the recipients of the letters to see a particular pattern. So you do see some countries that are in the neighborhood of the People's Republic of China, but you also see Serbia and Moldova. It's just not clear to me why these are the 21 or so countries that are being targeted. I also don't see, he seems to be embracing the chaos. So what's really been powerful for the U.S. over the last 50 to 80 years is that we tend to be the destination market for people's exports. And that's what's giving him all the power to yank people's chains with these letters. The letters don't have any legal effect. I would wait to see proclamations in order to have an understanding of what he's really trying to do. So it seems like he understands that he has some leverage here, and this is how he's choosing to deploy it. Why with these particular countries or in this particular way, I cannot tell you.
And one quick follow-up question. When it comes to a Canada or an EU, I understand the auto and I understand the the tariffs that aren't like country specific, the ones that have more meat on the bone. But you've got this legal process that sort of has clouded the outlook for these sort of unilateral arbitrary tariffs that Trump keeps threatening. What is it about these countries that I would expect them all to just try to delay, just wait until the court whacks them for good, as opposed to, negotiating in good faith? What's your take on how the countries are responding? There's just such a wide variety of analysis out there on what's ultimately going to happen. We keep getting told that there's an EU deal imminently. What's the incentive for these countries to cut deals and just kind of give us a sense from their perspective how they're thinking about Trump's negotiating leverage? You mentioned obviously that all these countries think of us as a destination for their exports, but you also have this legal process, so there seem to be a lot of variables there.
I don't know that I have confidence that the Supreme Court will strike down the tariffs. So you had split decisions, one by the Court of International Trade, one by a district court. The Court of International Trade has subject matter expertise and jurisdiction. The district court doesn't. I found the Court of International Trade ruling to be really thoughtful and careful, and it was a 3-judge panel. One of those judges was nominated by President Trump in his first term, although he's a Democrat. So I would say that was a well-reasoned decision, but it doesn't necessarily mean the Supreme Court is going to agree with it. So I think there is uncertainty. We've seen the Supreme Court make some decisions that surprised people in other areas. So I can understand if I'm a country that has a heavy export dependency on the United States, it is a risk to have these tariffs come on for real, impact the exports, and then struggle to try to take those tariffs off. Because once they're on, you have an uphill battle to get them off. He will take tariffs off if he decides it's in his interest to do so, but I have some sympathy for why countries aren't just being defiant.
Neil, do you have a question?
Yeah, so I think one thing that's interesting with this latest sort of barrage is, right, he's still not touching USMCA, and we have a sort of detente with China. So that's a lot of US's trade right there. What do you think the sort of impact of, if he goes through with the August 1st deadline and this latest barrage of tariffs, what do you think the impact would be?
I think we'll have to make sure that anything in the proclamation actually exempts USMCA. So they've gone a little bit back and forth with previous proclamations on USMCA. So I would also not be, I agree with you that they're likely to be exempted, and somebody said they would be exempted, but you always have to see what's in the proclamation, because it sounds like there are all these internal negotiations within the White House to get those proclamations ready and on his desk. So I would keep my eye on that. I think he said, if you're on this list, it's a good sign because it means we're negotiating with you and we think we're going to have a deal. Whether that's accurate or not, I don't know. But it is a very odd mix of countries, in my opinion.
Yeah, that makes sense. The other thing that I thought was really interesting is he recently opened 2 more national security investigations. One into sort of drones and the different components that go into drones, and one for silicon, and that could impact both the solar industry as well as chips. I thought that was my gut reaction. I'd love to get your reaction, your take on this. Is that was sort of interesting because both of those industries, obviously, China could be impacted by any tariffs that come out of those investigations. So we haven't heard, like they had this sort of deal, quote unquote, with China, and we haven't seen much about it in this latest round. Do you think that sort of opens a front for the U.S.-China trade war, reopens that at all down the line after those, investigations realistically result in tariffs?
It'll be interesting to see. China has a lot of leverage vis-a-vis the United States that a lot of other countries don't have, just because the way the system evolved, we're dependent on the PRC for a lot of inputs, and including the critical minerals and the rare earths. So I think we saw that. That's part of the reason that I think you saw the Trump administration stand down with China from initially a very, very hawkish position, even talking about loosening export controls, for example. It's precisely because China has cards to play, and China, to me, is being very adept in how they play them this time around. The first term, they were very wolf warrior and alienated a lot of other countries that might have been potential allies for them. I do not see them doing that this time. So that's one response. The other response is on the 232 authority. That is a much safer authority for them to use than the authority they used for the Liberation Day tariffs, just because of the way Congress delegated that authority to the president. That's a pretty tailored statute that at the same time gives the president a lot of leeway there. It's what he used in his first term for steel and aluminum and started an investigation on autos. That's much safer ground. I think you might be seeing the administration more carefully pick out in the sectors how they want to go about invigorating domestic production. But again, what I'm seeing is a lot of tariffs. I think some of these industries are going to need carrots. So the theory behind the Inflation Reduction Act and those types of industrial policy efforts under the Biden administration was that the tariffs, sure, they're sticks, but you actually need real carrots to induce investment. I don't know if the current administration is going to evolve in that direction.
Yeah.
You mentioned China, Beth. What do you think they are? I mean, from my perspective, obviously, I don't know nearly as much about what they're doing that's savvy or not, but it strikes me that, sort of one of their very obvious, power points is rare earths, which really seems to disrupt U.S. industry anytime China starts cutting off availability there, or slow rolling, negotiations with companies. Curious if it's rare earths and what else China's doing that they're, exerting leverage over the U.S. and and also maybe even just talk about rare earths a little bit. I know you had some experience there in your time, and some thoughts about how that market really works.
Yeah, so rare earths is a great example of a choke point in the system. And again, the pandemic revealed some of these choke points. The goal should be to diversify away from the PRC and not just come in with a bunch of tariffs on products that you can't necessarily source elsewhere. One of the situations with rare earths that market-oriented actors and economies have to confront is that the PRC, as a state-led economy, a state capitalist economy, is able to exert a lot of influence over the domestic market and their domestic producers, but also over the global market. So you can see them, for example, some countries will start production of rare earth minerals because the price is high. You might see the PRC then come in, dump a bunch of stuff on the market and tank the price, which makes it hard for market-oriented competitors who have to turn a profit to be able to stay in. So I think you see what we probably call domestically market manipulation by the PRC to preserve the choke points that it has in the global trading system on these very important products. So that to me is the most salient example of how they've been able to deploy their power very strategically this round. But it's also smaller things like Xi just refused to be in that Oval Office hot seat that we've seen other leaders in, like Zelensky. He just refused to sit there. So where did they end up meeting to have their trade talks? It was in Geneva, which is considered a neutral site for trade purposes. So you're just seeing them be very careful. And again, not a big PR campaign, just sitting by quite quietly and understanding where their leverage is and deploying it strategically. At least that's what I'm seeing.
And so as a result, so China, we quickly find out we don't have leverage there. What is that, like 95% of our trade problems? So Trump is basically spending all this effort to, whack countries that are less powerful and not as significant of a trading partner. It seems a little unusual. So I want to get your reaction there. How big of a problem are all these other countries that he's focusing on now?
So one of the reasons I'm a little bit, sorry, Teddy, were you done with your question?
Oh, no. Go ahead.
Okay. One of the reasons I am a little bit less on the taco bandwagon is that those initial tariffs on Canada and Mexico out of the gates made no sense to me for exactly this reason. If you look at the Project 2025, it has two trade chapters. One's a free trade chapter, which is old school. We shouldn't have chapters essentially other than getting rid of all tariffs, very libertarian. Then you also had the fair trade chapter, which was written by Peter Navarro, that was all about China. And we know Peter Navarro came to the Trump administration the first time around as a China hawk. If your fair trade chapter, which is the chapter that likes tariffs, recognizes that the real challenge is the PRC, why out of the gates are you coming at Canada and Mexico along with China? That didn't make sense to me, and said, okay, they're willing to do some things here that to me are not part of a logical sequence, even in terms of what they've articulated as their goals for the system. So what exactly is going on? I don't know. It could be with Canada and Mexico that this is all a setup for a potential USMCA renegotiation. That's possible. I do think with Canada was really sort of good when we were in the Biden administration about recognizing the threat of the PRC and working with us on that. So I'm again surprised that Canada would be in the line of fire. Mexico, there is a challenge, and if you think about what was happening with the UAW and that successful strike in 2023, there was a rumor that at least one of the American auto companies said, we will break your union power by moving everything to Mexico. So I can see a dynamic in which you'd want to be thoughtful about what our relationship is like with Mexico so that you're not incentivizing further labor arbitrage down south, which has already been quite disruptive. There's also the challenge of a lot of Chinese investment in Mexico, including in connected vehicles, which has a lot of data. So that plays into the whole question of where everybody's data is going. So if you're thinking about it carefully, there are different strategies you could deploy, but none of them would be the strategy they're deploying right now. And maybe one other point on all of these other countries and economies and why they're struggling to figure out how to respond. For an economy like Europe, it's a bit of a double whammy where they ended up with an export dependency on the United States that in many respects worked very well for them. But they're also confronting the fact that a lot of that Chinese production that was destined for the United States is now going to be headed for Europe. So that's a real squeeze that Europe is feeling. The solution for Europe is to essentially do a better job of being a unified internal market, which is what Mario Draghi has been pushing, so that you leverage EU consumption power and make yourself less dependent on exports to the United States. That is really hard for Europeans to wrap their minds around because export orientation has been such a core part of the way they've organized themselves in the global trading system after 1995 when the WTO was founded.
Maybe that's a good, oh, go ahead, Neil.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point because, you know, you're like seeing some articles come out that Europe maybe is talking about, or people are at least pushing for Europe to work with other trading partners to retaliate. There's a lot of talk about sort of collaborating between countries on retaliation against the US. So far, we haven't seen much retaliation. Do you think that's coming? Do you think that's not coming? And does the prospect of sort of a coordinated retaliation effort against the US, do you think that's feasible, or is that a little bit of a pipe dream?
It's a really interesting question. So again, because there's a risk that the United States ends up tanking the entire global economy, because you're already seeing the impact of some of the tariffs on manufacturing and different trading partners, I do understand why they are treading carefully in terms of retaliation and how they respond. Again, it's a question of, do these letters, which are not legally meaningful, do they translate into tariffs on August 1st? Or is there a way that these countries can navigate some kind of off-ramp, which in some cases they've been able to do? So we really don't know. And it's in fact the chaos that I think President Trump thrives on. I think he likes it. I think he finds it gives him leverage. And I don't see it abating, to be quite honest. So that's already one challenge for these countries. They have talked about coordinating. Different economies have different strengths and weaknesses. I think they could try to coordinate. You're going to have a prisoner's dilemma. It's always going to be in somebody's interest to defect. And I think this administration is showing itself adept at understanding how to split allies. And I think they came out of the gates. Part of their goal was actually to create chaos within the European Union to try to break apart the European Union itself. So I'm sympathetic to why people are treading carefully. One thing I think is a giant mistake that I have seen floated is for the European Union to think that joining the CPTPP is going to help them get out of this pickle. It will not. And I cannot believe we are in 2025, 10 years after debates in the United States where TPP failed in the United States in large part because those supply chain rules are designed to lock in Chinese supply chains. The fact that the Europeans still don't understand that really boggles my mind and says to me that the trade establishment in the EU has still not come to grips with the fact that the global economy in 2015 is not the same as the global economy was in 1995 or 2001 when China acceded to the WTO, and that they are not even learning lessons from the pandemic and the fact that we saw these concentrated supply chain dependencies that free trade orthodoxy tells you would never happen because we'd have lots of competition and diversification. So I would say what they're reaching for is sort of, not the retaliation path, but the cooperation path. But if they choose a cooperation path that embeds their dependency on China, they will not have solved for the other side of the equation that they feel they need to solve for at this point.
You bring up this sort of like neoliberal sort of commitment by these European trade establishment, but there seems to be still like this libertarian or, in some ways neoliberal streak running through the Trump administration. I think that's what makes the chaos so confusing, because it still seems like in many respects, big tech is getting everything they want out of Trump's, rhetoric to this point, right? They got Trump to say, threaten Canada to repeal their digital services tax, which is a huge win for big tech. He consistently touts big tech talking points when it comes to attacking Europe and European regulation. What is going on with, at the same time, obviously you have these tariffs, but you also have antitrust enforcers continuing with their lawsuits against big tech. So what's your perspective on how big tech still is kind of running the show on trade in the US, even as they face headwinds elsewhere?
That's a great question, Teddy. So one of the things we did in the Biden administration was to sync up what we were doing on trade with what the rest of the administration was doing domestically. I always say this is the thing people didn't really appreciate enough in terms of how significant it is to make sure that your trade policy is supporting the other things that you're doing in your economy. Because for so long, the trade stuff ran on a totally separate track. That was part of the neoliberal approach to trade. Antitrust domestically is not related to trade policy. Obama did it, he does the auto bailout and extends the auto bailout all the way to auto parts because it's such an important part of the economy, but then turns around with TPP and has supply chain rules that are going to offshore all that stuff, not even to Malaysia, but to China. So what we did when we came in was really try to make sure that we were thinking about trade policy in a way that was supporting the other goals of President Biden. I don't know that that's happening under this administration. And so what you see, in my view, is a rejection of neoliberalism when it comes to manufacturing. And the U.S. Trade Representative right now comes from that petitioner's bar where they're representing manufacturing industries that are suffering as a result of unfair competition. It's where Trump's first trade representative came from as well, Ambassador Lighthizer. So Ambassador Greer, Ambassador Lighthizer, they understand what unfair competition does and what the neoliberal model does to domestic manufacturing. That part they get. I'm concerned that if you come from that manufacturing background and you're not thinking about your domestic policy and your trade policy syncing up in other sectors, you are essentially running a neoliberal playbook on the other stuff. So when I look at what's happening with social media, I'm seeing a lot of the, frankly, Obama era social media, big tech policies, those neoliberal policies being carried forward, whereas in our case, that is what we said no to. We refused to continue the neoliberal big tech agenda for which we were pummeled, right? But that's what I see with this administration, and that's why all the focus on non-tariff barriers tends to be the types of things that really reflect a neoliberal trade policy, and I'm not sure they've wrestled with how to tackle those problems. And if you think about USTR, very, very heavily concentrated with career staff, a pretty thin political layer. A lot of the career staff has been there for 20 to 30 years. They only know how to do neoliberalism. To them, it's like mother's milk. When we came in and said, hey, we're going to tackle some of these non-tariff barriers in a different way, just because a company is complaining about a regulation doesn't mean the U.S. government should be trying to take that regulation down. So I see that as a big difference between what we were trying to do, which was a more comprehensive break with neoliberalism, and where this group is, where they certainly get the break with neoliberalism on the manufacturing side, but may not have even thought about breaking with neoliberalism on the non-tariff barrier side.
So it'll be interesting. I think perhaps maybe this is why the semiconductor stuff is so interesting and kind of hard to parse out and sort of game out, because on the one hand, you're going to have you have a manufacturing sector, you have the customers are big tech. So you're going to have this manufacturing, how do we reshore manufacturing instinct, but you've got this neoliberal power center in trade where the customer is big tech. Is that an interesting place to look for a clash there? Not only an internal ideological clash, but also, all right, who's really going to win at the end of the day? The sort of neoliberal Obama era deep state trade folks, or these leadership who cares about manufacturing. Because if you think about it, on one hand, if you're gonna, well, I'll just leave it at that, and then maybe we could get into some of the potentially interesting challenges specifically for that, for the semiconductor piece.
Yeah, Teddy, what you're pointing out is that there will inevitably be a conflict between your domestic and your trade policies, and you will have to pick a side. So I think you're right about that. One of the things that struck me when we were in and big tech was very unhappy with us is I didn't feel that the policy people in the companies had a great feel for the way trade policy was changing and evolving, so that many of these folks, it struck me, were stuck in an old way of thinking. And so a lot of these companies haven't thought about manufacturing policy because they haven't had to, because everything was offshored. So that they have spent a lot of their time and energy on these non-tariff barriers, and I'm not sure they even know how to engage with post-neoliberalism on the manufacturing side. Something I will be watching for. Who among these companies has put thought into manufacturing? Through the rumor mill, I've heard that some of these big tech companies have been trying to manufacture in the United States. If that's the case, and it's some of them but not others, they may find themselves in a favored position with the administration because they will be less likely to have that reflexive reaction to try to oppose all tariffs. So you're right to point out that this will inevitably intersect, and it's an area where I'm not sure all the companies are exactly in the same position, and we'll see whether they are able to adapt and maneuver in a very different world.
Beth, can you just quickly spell out what would it look like for a company to have more of a sense of what they need to ask for on manufacturing policy? Is that going to be asking for, manufacturing tax breaks or cash to help make investments, or what would be like a savvy company that wants to manufacture in the U.S.? What is their wish list that they would go to?
I think some of the savvy companies, again, I don't have firsthand knowledge of this, but I've heard it, is that they saw the writing on the wall in the first term, saw where the Biden administration was going, which was with a real commitment to domestic manufacturing as well, and therefore anticipated that they were going to need to be doing more nearshoring and more domestic production, so that those steps may already be underway, in which case those companies may benefit from some of the tariffs that go on if they're further advanced in where they're able to source some of their materials. These companies are awash in cash. So do they need the incentives to do it? The ones that anticipated that things were just changing and you had to make things here are already on track to do that, again, if these rumors are correct. But the others, no, companies are always, if possible, going to see what they can get the federal government to pay for. So if there is any kind of effort to do legislation, the same way there was the CHIPS Act, for example, I'm sure these companies will be looking for tax credits and subsidies and the usual playbook of government assistance to further incentivize domestic manufacturing.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Just to come back, I think another kind of pivot point here is, I think there's like an expectation that, specifically with semiconductors, that all right, potentially, can the semiconductor companies and the customers can rely on sort of how generous USMCA is in terms of just, hey, we'll just make it in Mexico. If we can't make it in China, we'll make it in Mexico, or we'll ship it to Mexico and just have a little piece added there, and then boom, we're good. That would obviously undermine what the Trump administration is trying to do, but it would be what powerful companies in that space would want, right? That's sort of a specific, that's sort of a sweet spot for us, right? USMCA, semiconductor, neolib instincts versus manufacturing, in that, you're certainly not going to incentivize any manufacturing to come back to the US if you could just exploit a loophole in USMCA in Mexico. So how do you see something like that playing out, or what should we be watching? And is that a good situation to watch as things unfold for, how this dynamic will play out?
So, I'm a lawyer, so by nature very cautious. This is one of the reasons I'm less 100% sure USMCA is always going to get a carve out. If you were really devising a comprehensive strategy for a combination of domestic manufacturing and nearshoring, so that we don't have a repeat of what we did in the pandemic, what we experienced during the pandemic, but you're also mindful that when we talk about semiconductors, national security is implicated, then you would want to develop a holistic strategy, look at who your trading partners are, look at what can be made where, and have that kind of diversification. I think President Trump has said he wants all steel to be made in the United States. Okay, but that's also a certain form of concentration risk. So we should be thinking carefully about making sure we have genuinely diversified production. But I don't see that happening here. I don't see a strategy to say, how do we have a North American production model where we have some work being done in Mexico, some work being done in Canada? What can we reasonably do in the United States, recognizing that even if you corrected for all the labor arbitrage we see, wage rates in Mexico are going to be lower for a variety of reasons. So that to me would be a really thoughtful strategy so that you can tackle this problem, and you go to the companies and you say, you are making money hand over fist. You're not going to be able to source things as cheaply as you used to be able to do. It's in your interest for U.S. national security to be shored up, and this is how we're going to do things. And I think it was Keynes who said, if you're tough enough, companies will fall in line. But that to me would be a rational way of approaching all of this. We'll see what they do with the semiconductor investigation, but it is such a comprehensive scope. You would want to probably do nuanced measures at various stages of the supply chain. I don't think President Trump likes doing nuanced tariffs. I think he likes big, bold numbers that are pretty uniform. So that's my instinct for how that's going to come out. And then we'll see about USMCA, whether they get the carve out.
Yeah.
Yeah. Actually, I want to turn to something, that is in a similar vein, but that sort of pushes back a little bit on, or not pushes back, but sort of is a little even incoherent in terms of Trump people focusing so much on manufacturing. Neil just put out a piece on pharmaceutical. And again, if you're thinking about neoliberalism, if you think about the trade order of the last 30, 40 years, the US has basically done whatever pharma wants when it comes to trade, particularly around IP. But Trump has threatened 200% tariffs on on pharma. And, Neil and I spent a lot of time on this. It actually goes after the IP and really is not going to have a meaningful impact on the manufacturing. It's really more targeted towards intellectual property that's pushed offshore and booked there for tax purposes. It's like an IP tax arbitrage kind of play. How do you think about Trump going after that specifically, neoliberalism, manufacturing? The companies have responded by saying, listen, we're going to build some stuff in the US, don't worry about it. The tariffs will go away. But there's almost a disconnect there where that one's actually not really about manufacturing. That's more about, particularly on the brand side, that's really more about on the IP problem. What's your reaction when you see something like that going on on the pharma side?
It's a little bit what I was saying before, which is one of the most effective aspects of neoliberalism was to separate tax policy from manufacturing policy from trade policy. All these issues are siloed. And so you don't understand the connectivity among them, even though in an economy, everything is ultimately connected. So my question is, when the administration came up with this plan, did they put as much thought into it as you and Neil did? Did they understand the connectivity that you and Neil understand? Or is this another example of, if I just put on a lot of tariffs, I'm going to get domestic manufacturing? It feels like that's the instinct, especially since President Trump identifies with the Gilded Age model of trade, where under the McKinley tariff, we did have very, very high tariffs. We had manufacturing, but we also had an enormous amount of labor unrest. So if they're going back to that pre-New Deal playbook, it's hard for me to see how they're going to get the results that they are looking for, because the global economy is not structured the way it was back in the 19th century. And I also don't think opportunities for things like tax arbitrage existed the way they do today. We didn't even have an income tax back then. So to me, this is another example of why it's so important to make sure you understand what you're trying to do domestically, what you're trying to do with your trade policy, understanding tax, manufacturing, intellectual property, that these are not separate issues, and making sure that the plan you have syncs them all up so that you end up with the results you say you want. I don't doubt that the president wants domestic manufacturing of pharmaceutical products, and there is some. We saw that during the pandemic when we were looking at domestic production of vaccines and treatments. But there is an outsized dependency. We can see trying to solve for that. But it also goes back to what I was saying about semiconductors. Who are your trading partners? How do you want to structure it so that we are making the most of the relationships we have and the things that our trading partners are good at doing? That part just doesn't seem to be part of this administration's ethos, and it seems like a missed opportunity.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, and I think it's an interesting point about them siloing off the different spheres, you know, tax and trade. When I was, for people who are listening in and haven't had a chance to read the article because it just came out, it sort of talks, right, so they park the IP in Ireland, and then when they're importing drugs from Ireland into the US, the value of that IP is going to be caught up in the tariff. So it greatly increases companies' sort of exposure to tariffs, and tariffs actually might sort of incentivize in that way companies to shift IP or IP rights back to the US. So I think that's a really interesting thing. But going to your point, Beth, when I was talking to people for this article, a lot of what people were saying is like, tariffs might have this impact if you really want to get after this, you know, this sort of profit offshoring that companies are doing. The most direct way is to go after the tax code, right? And tariffs can play some role, but to just make it illegal to use these sort of profit offshoring strategies. But I don't see the administration sort of going after those sort of profit offshoring strategies. And in fact, they're, decreasing taxes in the US. So we're sort of running the neoliberal playbook. Oh, we have profit offshoring. Let me cut taxes even more in the US and win the race to the bottom. So I think that's sort of interesting. And yeah.
One other aspect of this, though, is that Trump does hate trade deficits. And this is like a big trade deficit, even if it's not for manufacturing related. It looks like we lose money, we're losing money on pharma. We're booking losses here and we're booking gains there. And it looks like a huge, trade deficit with Ireland because of that. And so it's interesting in that it's not unreasonable for the pharma companies to just sort of say, hey, we're going to manufacture there. We're going to invest in manufacturing there. Take off the tariffs, because the real game is the IP side of it. But we really can't be sure that will work with Trump, because fine, I'm getting manufacturing, but you're not really fixing my trade deficit problem. And so even if they're not cognizant entirely of the connection between tax and trade and manufacturing, they might be aware enough that they know it creates a deficit. Am I overthinking this? This is so convoluted at this point. I feel like a crazy person connecting the dots, but I want to get your reaction to what I just kind of laid out there.
I do not think you are crazy, Teddy. So part of the challenge here is the administration wants any number of conflicting things. And this has been true from the beginning. They want a strong dollar. They want a weak dollar. They want the dollar to be the reserve currency. They don't want the dollar to be the reserve currency, on and on and on. And so it's difficult to understand how all these different pieces are going to fit together, because many of them are in conflict with each other. And that goes back to the fact that you had 2 trade chapters in the Project 2025 playbook. So this is a really difficult issue to navigate. We're coming out of Wimbledon last week, and I was thinking of President Trump as sort of your tennis player who has a serve that they really like to hit, right? So like they like to hit that serve out wide. And I feel like tariffs are that shot that he just hits over and over again. He likes them, he likes the tool, he wants to keep using it, but it is actually not going to solve all your problems. You cannot only hit serves out wide and expect to win Wimbledon. So this is, I think, a challenge, and probably for people on his team who are trying to figure out how to navigate this themselves, that we keep coming back to the same tool no matter what the issue. So we also saw tariffs on Brazil because of Bolsonaro. It just tariffs for everything. No matter what the issue, I'm going to use a tariff with no real plan for how those tariffs are going to deliver the result that you're hoping for.
Can you talk a little bit about that Brazil? I know you've taken a look at that and might have some thoughts on that. To the extent that we've got a big tech element in there, I want to touch on that as well. Neil, I don't know if you have any specific questions about Brazil for Beth, but I would love to just spend a minute on that if we can.
Yeah, I'll kick it over to Beth to get her reaction first.
Yeah, it's interesting. That letter to Lula about Bolsonaro was interesting, with something like a 50% tariff on Brazil, so really singling Brazil out, but followed with the recent self-initiated petition by USTR under Section 301 against Brazil for a range of sins, and I'll get into those. But most importantly, perhaps we're starting to see the Section 301 investigation as the natural hedge against what the Supreme Court may or may not do with the emergency tariffs that were imposed and struck down by the lower courts. So let's keep our eye on this mechanism that runs through USTR, the Section 301 investigation. That is what Ambassador Lighthizer used against China in the first term for people who are trying to keep track of all these different delegations of authority that give the president tariff power. So this Section 301 against Brazil, I think, is quite interesting. This plays right up with the question about the degree to which this administration is tackling post-neoliberalism or not. This looks like a pretty neoliberal laundry list to me, in that it starts off with social media. So this is another example of the administration looking out for big tech companies in a way that we in the Biden administration were not. There's some other issues in there that might be surprising to people. Deforestation, but deforestation is interesting in that, first of all, this is something that when House Democrats insisted on renegotiating the Peru FTA 15 years ago, we said deforestation is a real problem and we need to address it, not only for climate reasons, but for competitiveness reasons. If you have illegal logging going on, that's disadvantageous to American lumber producers. That's something where you see the president taking action under Section 232 on lumber, and also trying to make, as I read the proclamation or executive order, maybe opening up national lands to deforestation in a way that we have not seen in a generation. So looking at all those different pieces of the puzzle, I also see in there a reference to anti-corruption. And so is that meant to be suggesting that Lula is engaged in some kind of corruption for the prosecution of Bolsonaro? The other piece that's interesting to me, they don't seem to have latched on to the fact that competition is one of the criteria in Section 301. And my understanding is there actually is a meatpacking consolidation problem in Brazil that is related to deforestation. Those lands are being deforested in a way that is lining the pockets of, I don't know if you would call it a meat packing cartel, maybe you all know, but I don't see ranchers getting a specific shout out in that investigation. It's something I heard about ranchers when I was out in Idaho, heard a lot about ranchers feeling the pinch from the tariffs because they export to places that really like American beef, and some of the retaliation is biting them. So will this investigation be used to provide some kind of relief to those ranchers who are suffering on the other side? From my first glance at the way they described the petition, no, but that could change.
Yeah, one thing that I think
Can I just follow up quickly on that? How does that change? Like, how did the, if enough of the beef industry, farmers and ranchers complain, can they add that in? It definitely seems like, this has come up in the antitrust context a lot. Obviously, like DOJ has done investigations into this. JBG has been scrutinized, or not JBG, JAB, whatever the company is.
JBL? Is it JBL?
What, I don't know what it's called. Yeah, something, J something, some massive conglomerate. But how easy or hard is it to get added in as an issue once they've sort of already gone out with something like this?
I would say for this administration, assuming it's not in the actual investigation already, I was looking at their press release, it isn't so much that they would amend it to add in the competition issue, but in the nature of the relief that you're seeking, they could try to ensure that, assuming it results in a negotiation with Brazil, they could try to make sure that the ranchers are looked after in whatever kind of negotiated settlement there is. Again, these delegations of authority from Congress have been very, very significant and very, very broad. And we are coming up against a realization that perhaps people feel that was too much deference to the executive branch.
Neil, I know I cut you off. You had a question there.
Yeah, well, one thing that I wanted to make sure that I understood and that I think could be really important, something that you mentioned, Beth, that I think could be really important for people to make sure they understand is you talked a little bit about these Section 301 providing like a legal basis for the administration to basically hedge their bet if the Supreme Court, does strike down the reciprocal day, the Liberation Day reciprocal tariffs. So my understanding is that, and correct me when I get something wrong, but that the Section 301, so those are sort of investigating a country for their trade practices. That's what they're using against Brazil, and that could provide the basis for sort of, tariffs against Brazil generally, right? So there might be more, I guess you could say it's country specific tariffs that could come out of that. Then we talked earlier in the program about these sort of Section 232, so that's the national security investigations that we were talking about, and that those tend to be more product specific. So you're saying that if we start to see more of these Section 301 investigations, which are the country specific, that could provide another avenue for the administration to impose broad tariffs on countries in general. Am I summarizing what you said correctly or incorrectly?
You're summarizing that correctly, and I don't think Section 301 is limited to tariffs. So it's pretty broad. It would have to be within the president's existing powers otherwise. But I think some people just assume that Section 301 is limited to tariffs because that's how it's traditionally been used. But for example, on shipbuilding, the administration used it to impose fees on ships, which is not exactly the same as tariffs. So yeah, you're right about that. And I should probably point out something else that I think is interesting in this Brazil investigation. To go after Brazil on anti-corruption, and the U.S. does have an anti-corruption trade agreement with Brazil from 2011 that was updated in 2022. It's fascinating to me that an administration that is rolling back enforcement of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which is arguably a breach of that agreement with Brazil, is going after Brazil on anti-corruption. I find that fascinating.
Well, not only did they roll back, they have meme dinner, meme coin dinners. I mean, we could spend all day listing the corrupt actions of the current government that would undermine, I think, provisions like that. But as much as I would like to do that, we're running out of time. So I want to get to these two audience questions. First here is fate of provisions in previously negotiated agreements, initiatives like USMCA, IPEF, Taiwan Initiative. What's your reaction to that? I don't even know if that's necessarily a question, but we've touched on USMCA a little bit. We're not totally confident every tariff situation is going to respect what's already in there. Obviously they're positioning to renegotiate that, but what's your overall assessment on how USMCA, IPEF, and Taiwan Initiative hold up?
So we talked about USMCA. I would say IPEF is in a different category. The trade agreements the Biden administration negotiated were not tariff agreements for a specific reason, which is we felt that it was important to learn lessons from the pandemic before we did further tariff cuts and figure out exactly what kind of manufacturing you are and are not incentivizing with those tariff cuts. So that's why you saw the Biden administration go in that direction. There were pillars of IPEF. The trade pillar was not concluded. The other pillars were supply chains, anti-corruption. Those can continue, but they're not really implicated the way USMCA would be, because that is a tariff-cutting comprehensive agreement. So it's in a different category. On Taiwan, we did complete the first tranche when we were in. There were supposed to be multiple tranches. My understanding is those negotiations are ongoing, but again, there aren't tariff implications for that Taiwan agreement unless the administration wants to introduce tariff provisions. That ends up being very complicated because Taiwan's manufacturing is deeply intertwined with the PRC for geographical reasons. So if the goal is to diversify away from the PRC, you'll have to be very thoughtful about how you do that. So USMCA really stands alone in terms of this conversation. We don't tend to talk about all those other free trade agreements that are out there with Korea, with Peru, with Colombia, with Central American countries. They aren't getting as much attention. We're not seeing the exemptions for those agreements that we've seen with the USMCA, partly because in many ways the North American market is quite integrated, and we are, especially on the auto side, that production is really integrated. And so that, I think, is a real question, how these other free trade agreements are and are not being folded into the conversation.
And then last question here, antitrust implications. I mean, I could see this going in a lot of different ways. Obviously, I mean, maybe I can rephrase this into a specific question. One of the things that comes up a lot when it comes to trade is, look, if things are hostile, particularly with the EU and China, those governments will threaten a further crackdown with conduct investigations into US big tech. Or China specifically will hold out merger reviews. So I guess one way to think about this is, do we think things will get more, will continue? Do we think things with Europe and China in particular will get better or less hostile as the Trump administration is going? Do we expect volatility there? Maybe that's a more specific way to look at antitrust implications. Unless you have other thoughts on sort of Trump and antitrust implications from what he's doing on trade.
The China piece is a really fascinating one. So China has for a long time, to your point, used the merger review process and used its competition policy, again, as a way of retaliating against trading partners that it's unhappy with in ways that are, they're just retaliatory. They do the same thing on some of these trade remedy reviews. So it's one of the reasons that the PRC really can't be seen as a good faith actor in the WTO system. When we tried, again, aligning our trade policy and our antitrust policy on the inside, we took a look at the competition chapters of our trade agreements and said, well, this is a consumer welfare standard. This is the old way of looking at competition policy, the neoliberal way of looking at competition policy. We're going to update this and make it more contemporary. And the Chamber of Commerce had a fit, and some of their friends in the House and the Senate equally had a fit and interpreted it as us going easy on China, which was, of course, not the case. We were not negotiating an agreement with China. We were negotiating agreements with other trading partners and did not want a competition chapter that could be weaponized by monopolists to frustrate enforcement actions. So the China point is well taken and one that's very, very sensitive in the United States, and people are well aware of it, including in Congress. What I find interesting about the European Union, so they've stood down on the digital services tax. I actually understand, so did Canada. I understand why they did that. That was supposed to be done through the OECD. It was an option for them to use this tax, but it's revenue. It's not manufacturing jobs. And if you are making the decision to stand down on a tax because you think it's going to give you a better job of fending off tariffs and preserving manufacturing, I can understand why manufacturing dependent countries are making that choice. What I think is fundamentally different, especially about the EU, is they have enforcement mechanisms on tech. I think it's an entirely different proposition to twist the EU's arm into standing down on a domestic enforcement issue that I think is important to Europeans across the continent. I think that's actually a much tougher row to hoe for the Europeans. And if the tariff threats materialize and the Europeans feel like they have to fight back, I would say going full force on these enforcement actions is a really valuable tool for them. My understanding is the tech companies, that's a different kind of dependency, right? The tech companies are dependent on Europe for revenue. That's a vulnerability and a potential choke point for the EU to use.
I guess I have one last question. You mentioned China not being a good faith actor when it comes to merger and retaliatory. What are the implications of the U.S. Moving away from rule of law for big transactions? There's so many to list at this point, but the CVS transaction where it's only getting approval after a payout to the Trump organization over a libel lawsuit. We recently had a merger, HPE, that looked almost certainly politically motivated and coming from pressure from the White House or elsewhere, as opposed to sort of being an arm's length, an independent evaluation by DOJ. We could spend a lot of time on this also. The FTC, coming up with a host of seemingly, I wouldn't call them absurd, but bizarre remedies to allow mergers to go through. How does that affect, how does the rule of law, moving away from rule of law, moving towards politically driven merger decisions, does that, you mentioned China, when we are in that sort of, well, we're not really operating in good faith or according to the rule of law, how does that affect, how do other countries respond to that? Or what does that do? Does that affect us from a trade perspective?
Yeah, this is the area that actually worries me the most. It's not so much tariffs that are really high, because those can come down. People have workarounds. What really worries me is the stability we've enjoyed since the end of World War II. The U.S. has made mistakes. We've had wars of adventure that we never should have done. So we have flaws. I'm not being jingoistic. But generally speaking, our approach to hegemony was that peace would be promoted through making sure that poor people in the United States had enough to eat and that poor people in other countries had enough to eat. If you strip it all away, that was essentially the FDR post-war bargain that Dwight Eisenhower bought into, and that has governed the way we approach things for generations now. When I look at the totality of what this administration is doing, let's talk about USAID. We have extra peanut butter that we're not sending to starving children in Africa because we're tired of being a hegemon or whatever rationale is being provided. It's not even good for our own peanut farmers not to be doing that anymore. The wholesale destruction of soft power will be very, very hard to reestablish. So we shouldn't have used all of our soft power to decide that it was okay to offshore manufacturing jobs in a way that devastated the industrial heartland and is related to deaths of despair. But at the same time, I think there is a lack of appreciation for the fact that our overall commitment to rule of law and support for the well-being of peoples all over the world, even where we've made mistakes, that has been an essential part of our ability to actually run deficits. People feel comfortable with the dollar, and we're starting to see people be less comfortable with the dollar. And this is where I see it as very different from tariffs, because you can take the tariffs off. I don't know how you restore your reputation as a bastion of rule of law and democracy and hope for peoples around the world who, for our entire lifetimes, many of them have thought that that we were the standard bearer for things that are good in the world.
I think that's a great way to conclude. I also am very curious how sort of moving away from rule of law and democracy affects us, our trading. Obviously we've already seen some buying patterns in other countries. Tourism has dropped here. I mean, look, you can go to any restaurant in DC and they've cut staff in half if it's at all a tourist destination. Tourism in DC has absolutely dropped off a cliff. So interesting to see how that plays out. Beth, Neil, thank you so much for doing this. As always, a fascinating conversation. Can't wait to do it again.
Thank you, Teddy.
Thank you.